Hey guys, and welcome to video 2 for chapter 29. On this one, we're going to be getting into the French Revolution. Now, the American Revolution is pretty simple compared to the French Revolution. The French Revolution drew a lot of inspiration from both the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, but it took on a much more radical tone, the American Revolution, and it got a lot messier. American colonists wanted independence, but didn't really want to change their society. They just wanted to politically make their own decisions. French revolutionaries wanted a total overhaul of everything, and it got very complex and very bloody. Now, the French Revolution is typically broken down into 4 phases. You've got your opening, or sometimes called the moderate phase. You've got the radical phase, also sometimes referred to as the Reign of Terror. You've got the very short-lived Directory, which is the 3rd phase. And then you've got the rule of Napoleon. Now, the first slide will be talking about the opening phase, obviously by the title, and we're going to beginning with the conditions before the Revolution, where French society was still broken down into the 3 estates of medieval society. Right? You've got your clergy, your priests, you've got your nobles here, and your 3rd estate, you've got everybody else. And the majority of the 3rd estate were peasants. Now, the first estate, you look at this chart here, really didn't have to pay taxes. Being in the church, they were exempt from paying any taxes. The second barely had to pay any. So the majority of the tax burden fell on the 3rd estate. And you look at how disproportionate it is to their overall population and the percent of land owned and whatnot. So you can see why a political cartoon like this would come out, where the 1st and 2nd estates look like they're completely standing on and crushing the 3rd estate. With the 1st and 2nd, it looks like they're living the good life and comfortably, and so forth. All right, so in response to this, in trying to kind of raise some money, King Louis XVI, he was very, very heavy into debt. Hold on, let me get rid of this stuff here so you can see Louis in all of his glory. There he is. All right. He was really heavy into debt from all the, a number of wars, but especially lending aid in the American Revolution. The 7 Years' War as well, and everything like that. The thing to remember about Louis is that he wasn't a bad, tyrannical king. He just was an ineffective ruler. He wasn't able to inspire the people, and kind of the living the good life, and especially represented by his wife Marie Antoinette, it really angered people. So, in any event, he says that he needs to kind of raise some taxes, and so he tries taxing the nobility. They freak out. They say absolutely not. He realizes that he can't, kind of have everything from the 3rd estate because they just don't have enough money, and the 2nd estate is freaking out. So he decides to call the Estates General together. Now, the Estates General was a meeting of the 3 estates. Now, even though the 3rd estate vastly outnumbered the other 2 in terms of population, as you can see by the chart again, they still only got 1 vote, right? It was 1 vote per estate. So they were always outvoted by the 1st and 2nd. This led members of the 3rd estate to take more drastic steps. And they said, if we're not going to be able to match them vote for vote, let's just break away and form our own thing. And so they form the National Assembly. They do this with the tennis court oath, where they meet at a local tennis court, hence the name, and they swear not to disband until France has a new constitution. A few weeks later, a mob in Paris, fearing that the king would force this new group to disband, they stormed the Bastille. Now, the Bastille was a medieval fortress that housed political prisoners. This event on July 14, 1789, is generally viewed as the official start of the French Revolution, right? It's celebrated as their version of Independence Day, the way that we celebrate July 4th. Now, the audacity, right, the boldness, and the violence, because they killed a number of the guards of this crowd, it really worried the king and the nobility. Emboldened by this, the National Assembly then took another step of drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Now, obviously, it was influenced by the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, hence the name, and it proclaimed the equality of all men. Only men, right? Women left out. And it asserted individual rights of liberty, property, and security. Now, the National Assembly didn't just change French government. It wanted to change French society, as I said before. It used the principles of, as you see here, liberté, égalité, and fraternité. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. These were its goals. It abolished the old order that gave such privileges to the first and second estate. It negated a lot of the old taxes and fees that the peasants had to pay the nobility. It limited the power of the king, didn't abolish it yet, but it limited it. It made France a constitutional monarchy, much more similar to what Great Britain was at the time. It expanded voting privileges and took a more drastic approach to the church by drafting the civil constitution of the clergy. Now, this gave the French government official control of the church. It seized all of the church lands, right? So you see, proportionally, it had a fair amount of lands. It ended this exemption from taxes as well. You notice how, the gray here, percent of taxes, there is nothing here for the first estate. They said, no more of that. You got to start paying taxes. And it essentially made all priests and bishops government employees. Now, this more radical move would pale in comparison, though, to what would come next with the radical phrase and the Directory. Now, the revolution soon took a much more radical turn when the French nobles tried to gain foreign support for the king and restore the old ways. This led to France declaring war on Prussia and Austria in 1792 because they were worried that those countries were going to start sending their troops in to restore Louis to his full power. And then the following year they declared war on Spain, Britain, and the Netherlands. So France was pretty much now at war with all of Europe. This led revolutionary leaders to enact more severe measures, and they created the Convention. Now, the first step that the convention did was abolishing the monarchy and proclaiming France a republic. The problem, though, is that you have a king in Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette, so you have monarchs. Well, they decided the best way to resolve that situation was to put them on trial and execute them. And so in 1793, both Louis and his wife, Marie Antoinette, they were executed, and they were sent to the new symbol of the revolution, the guillotine. The guillotine was looked at as a being more humane way to quickly chop off their heads as opposed to the old school executioner swinging an axe. Now, unfortunately, the execution of a king and queen, even though it sent huge, ripples throughout Europe, that was not going to be the most radical action. And in fact, it only ramped things up, resulting in the Reign of Terror. Now, this phase of the revolution, which only really lasted for about a year, from 1793 to 1794, was led by this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, known as the Incorruptible. He was a lawyer, and he dominated the Committee of Public Safety, the executive authority in France at this time. He and his group, let me write this up here, the Jacobins, right? He was the leader of the Jacobins, who were the radical fringe of the revolution. They completely restructured French society. They created a new calendar, right? They decided to get rid of all of the old stuff because there was too much of an association with the church. They changed codes of dress. Let me move myself over here so you can see. The sans culottes, right, without the breeches, those kind of fancy high-knee pants that the upper-class nobility used to wear. They said, wear long trousers like real working men, that type of thing. And they actually tried to eliminate Christianity in France altogether and create this kind of secular society. They also executed thousands. Anyone who was accused of being against the revolution or this new society they were creating was sent to the guillotine. 40,000 people were beheaded and 300,000 imprisoned just from 1793 to 1794. Now, many of these victims were fellow revolutionaries who fell out of favor with Robespierre and the Jacobins because they weren't radical enough. Now, the intensity of the violence, it couldn't keep up. This led to the third phase of the revolution, the Directory. The convention eventually realized that Robespierre was going too far and he had to go. So in July of 1794, he was arrested and sent to the guillotine himself. This put the Directory in charge, which was a more conservative group, and it got rid of the craziness of the convention and the Jacobins. They tried to find a middle ground, but really couldn't find a consistent voice that worked for them. Overall, the Directory was viewed as being weak, and it was eventually toppled in 1799 when a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte seizes power. All right, so let's talk about Bonaparte here. He was born to a minor noble family on the island of Corsica. So technically he wasn't French, but obviously he was a French citizen because Corsica was a colony of France. Now, he was a brilliant military leader. There was no denying that. He was also a staunch supporter of the revolution in the early phases. His early victories against Austria and his very audacious invasion of Egypt made him a celebrity in France, and he parlayed this influence into joining the Directory in 1799. He soon overthrew it. As I said, it was viewed as being weak. He had no tolerance for it, and he named himself first consul, right? Kind of harkening back to the days of Rome. This gave him unchecked power. In 1802, he named himself consul for life, essentially dictator for life. And then in 1804, he said, why not go all in? And he crowned himself emperor. What's important to remember, though, is that each time he increased his power, he held what's called a plebiscite, which was a vote among the people. And every time they had a plebiscite, the people approved his expansion of power. So that showed his popularity. Now that he was emperor, he implemented several very significant reforms. Overall, his rule brought stability to a nation torn by revolution and war. For instance, the Concordat. The Concordat made peace with the Catholic Church. Now, it didn't give all the land back to the church, but it made Catholicism the preferred religion of France. It gave priests salaries and extended tolerance to Protestants and Jews. It was widely supported by revolutionaries who thought that the Jacobin persecution of the church went way too far. Probably Napoleon's most significant political accomplishment was the Napoleonic Code. Now, it was a revised body of civil law which gave political equality to all men. Again, just men. It also created a merit-based society, as opposed to the old order where birth and noble origins determined everything. It did retain a number of changes made by the National Assembly while taking back a lot of the more radical changes of the convention. Now, one group who didn't benefit from the new code, though, as I said, were women. It reaffirmed France's old-school patriarchal authority. Women had legal rights restricted, and they were legally subservient to men, wives to husbands and fathers and so forth. Now, although Napoleon approved of certain Enlightenment ideals of equality, he still restricted liberties. I mean, you look at the picture of him here, he's wearing the laurel of the ancient Roman emperors. This was a guy who was an autocratic emperor. I mean, he crowned himself emperor. He took the crown, from the Pope and decided, I'm doing this myself. The guy had quite an ego on him. He limited free speech. He censored the press. He used secret police, didn't acknowledge local representative governments. His main priority was building an empire, and he was very good at it. He sought to expand French control over all of Western Europe and put his family at the helm. Now, as I said before, he was a military genius, and his armies conquered Spain, Italy, Netherlands. He defeated Austrian and Prussian armies. I mean, you look at the size of it. You've got your French Empire. The lighter colored purple were countries allied with Napoleon, such as Austria and Prussia, because he defeated them in battle. Countries that were indirectly controlled by Napoleon, such as Spain, because he put his brother in charge there, and the Confederation of the Rhine and Naples and so forth, where he put other family relatives. He dreamed of creating this huge Bonaparte dynasty that would rule the entire continent. Now, his major mistake that started the unraveling of everything was in 1812 when he decided that he was going to take over Russia. And he led a disastrous invasion of Russia. He led 600,000 troops of his Grand Army into Russia. Now, even though they captured Moscow, his army found itself way too far from supply lines as the Russian winter set in. Unable to maintain the assault, he retreated back, but the cold and the Russians continued the assault. And by the time they made it back, only 30,000 of the original 600,000 were still alive. Right? He never recovered from this. You look at the picture here. You compare this to the majestic imagery of when he first came to power, and this one of being, a broken and battered individual. He was no longer viewed as being invincible. An international coalition of his enemies forced him to abdicate the throne in 1814, and even though he returned only a year later and reasserted control, this return only lasted another 100 days before he was defeated by the British at the Battle of Waterloo. He was after that banished to the island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. Okay, so as I said, a lot to go in there on the French Revolution and then in Napoleon, and we're going to be coming back and talking about the impacts of these revolutions and Napoleon in later videos.